The high country does not offer second chances. Across the subalpine plateaus of the Great Dividing Range, above the tree line where snow gums twist against relentless westerly gales, lies a landscape that seems entirely void of life. For centuries, these high-altitude glacial tarns and alpine headwaters sat sterile, frozen solid in winter, and baked under harsh ultraviolet light in summer. But 5 years ago, an ambitious and highly controversial ecological gamble was quietly launched into these icy heights, one that would fundamentally alter the wilderness and spark a fierce war over the very soul of the bush. It began with an audacious logistics operation that many veteran landholders called an absolute waste of taxpayer money. State resource managers set out to introduce millions of predatory rainbow trout fingerlings into remote alpine lakes where fish had never existed in recorded history. These weren't easily accessible farm dams. These were isolated water bodies sitting thousands of meters above sea level, far beyond the reach of any bitumen road. To get the stock to the summit, transport trucks could only wind so far up the treacherous fire trails before the tracks simply vanished into sheer granite scree. From there, human muscle took over. Teams of backcountry rangers and hired local bushmen strapped heavy, oxygen-pressurized water canisters to their frames, trudging up vertical ridgelines on foot. On the longest scrambles, the trek took 12 brutal hours, with the clock constantly ticking against the depleting oxygen supply inside the packs. Every single fingerling was no longer than a human finger, transported into an environment that rural locals insisted would swallow them whole. The station owners and mountain cattlemen who had worked this high country for generations were blunt. Nothing survives those freeze-thaw cycles, and these fish will be dead before the first frost. The price tag only fueled the public fury, an initial $12 million drawn directly from regional infrastructure funds. Rural bush communities demanded to know why public capital was being squandered on fish instead of critical road repairs, bushfire mitigation, or regional health clinics. But wildlife managers held up a socio-economic map of the high country that told a bleak story. It highlighted isolated timber towns and declining grazing districts, where whole generations of young people were abandoning the bush for capital cities, leaving behind dying local economies. The visionary behind the venture was an uncompromising fisheries ecologist who looked at these harsh alpine waterways and saw untapped bioenergy. He drew inspiration from commercial cold water fisheries in the icy lochs and montane streams of Tasmania and New Zealand, arguing that the fundamental hydrology of Australia's roof was misunderstood. On paper, the mathematical mechanics were sound. These isolated glacial tarns possessed ideal thermal conditions, consistently cold, hyper-oxygenated water that can hold vast amounts of dissolved gas compared to the sluggish, turbid rivers flowing through the lowland plains. In these frigid conditions, salmonids convert prey into dense muscle tissue with incredible biological efficiency. While the alpine lakes appeared completely barren to the untrained eye, their gravelly beds were teeming with a hidden, microscopic drift of cold-adapted amphipods, mayfly nymphs, and ancient mountain galaxias larvae, the ultimate high-protein food source for a juvenile trout. With zero competition and no native apex aquatic predators to hunt them, the fingerlings were positioned for explosive growth. Yet, the first winter almost vindicated the harshest critics. As an Antarctic polar blast swept across the southern continent, temperatures plunged well below freezing, locking the high tarns under thick sheets of black ice. Nearly 70% of the initial stocking perished within weeks. Shallow tarns froze solid, straight to the bedrock, while others suffered catastrophic oxygen depletion beneath the ice crust. The project seemed destined for the landfill of bureaucratic failures, but the surviving 30% performed a biological miracle that stunned the scientific community. By the following summer, field biologists conducting routine population surveys pulled out thriving trout weighing over half a kilogram. By year 2, individuals were tipping the scales at over a kilo, a growth rate that defied standard limnology for such resource-scarce alpine waters. The ecological engine had ignited. Word of giant trout thriving in the high country quickly rippled through the fly fishing subculture. A trickle of intrepid anglers turned into a flood, driving four-wheel drives up steep logging tracks just to throw a line into waters that were completely empty half a decade prior. Lowland visitors were spending money in struggling mountain hamlets that had previously relied solely on seasonal cattle grazing or timber harvest. Recognizing the momentum, state parks authorities rapidly expanded the infrastructure, constructing modular, low-footprint hatcheries right in the mountain valleys. The part of them fed by pure snowmelt. These decentralized hatcheries were deliberately primitive, simple concrete raceways fed by gravity-driven alpine water, requiring minimal mechanical upkeep. A local station hand could be trained to manage the entire broodstock in under a fortnight. Within 3 seasons, a dozen of these facilities were churning out nearly 20 million fingerlings annually, effectively acclimatizing the species to the mountain climate before release. The stocking runs transformed into lucrative seasonal labor for local bushmen, who received a bounty for every live batch successfully deposited into the target tarns. Naturally, the porters moved with ruthless speed through the scrub to keep the water temperature down and the fish alive. Then came the devastating winter of 2021, a brutal climatic anomaly that almost destroyed the entire system. A massive polar vortex dumped meters of heavy snow across the ranges, dropping temperatures down to -15 degrees Celsius, well below the 30-year climate average. The smaller, high-altitude tarns froze completely solid from surface to bed, suffocating every living organism within them. Of the 72 monitored alpine lakes, 20 lost their entire fish biomass in a matter of days. The lead ecologist later confessed that during this dark month, he believed the entire experiment had collapsed into an expensive ecological disaster. But then, an extraordinary grassroots intervention occurred, one that no government manual or management strategy had ever anticipated. The local mountain communities took matters into their own hands, stepping in without official orders or government pay. In remote valleys, timber workers and station owners trekked through waist-deep snow to cut aeration holes through the thick ice, setting up rostered watch camps in sub-zero winds. For nearly 4 weeks straight, teams operated around the clock, lighting wood fires on the frozen crust and manually smashing the ice every 2 hours to keep oxygen flowing to the water below. In another isolated catchment, 3 grazing families converted heavy wooden cattle troughs inside their machinery sheds into emergency nurseries. They carried fingerlings out of freezing streams and refreshed the water twice daily using non-freezing subterranean spring water. Out of 200 rescued fish, nearly 150 survived the freeze and were returned to the wild come spring. When state wildlife inspectors finally accessed the isolated catchments to assess the devastation, they discovered a startling truth. Wherever local communities had taken rogue action, fish mortality was 3 times lower than in unmanaged state waters. This unexpected local intervention completely reshaped government strategy. Realizing that top-down management was failing, state wildlife authorities formally handed operational control over to the mountain communities themselves. Each valley formed its own local water trust, armed with state equipment, a direct budget, and actual decision-making power. The value of local knowledge immediately proved superior to satellite surveys. During an initial strategy meeting, a veteran high-country grazier pointed to 3 tarns on the government stocking map and revealed that they dried up completely every 7 to 8 years during severe drought cycles. He had personally seen them vanish twice in his lifetime. The lead biologist cross-referenced the climate records and confirmed the old bushman's account. Those 3 water bodies were promptly struck from the program, saving tens of thousands of fingerlings from guaranteed destruction. Over the next 2 winters, winter mortality dropped from 50% down to 18%. A survival rate that established commercial fisheries would envy. But as the program stabilized, the story ceased to be about fish and began triggering unscripted socio-ecological chain reactions. Rural locals quickly calculated that a trophy trout swimming in a clear alpine stream brought vastly more wealth through high-spending fishing tourists than a dead fish sold at a local market. Almost overnight, systemic illegal poaching, a plague of illegal netting and destructive lime dosing, that had crippled mountain waterways for decades came to a sudden halt. It wasn't enforced by police, but by the landholders themselves, who patrolled their river boundaries with fierce vigilance. Community trusts established strict local bylaws, a catch limit of 2 fish per day, mandatory barbless single hooks, and complete closures during the autumn spawning run, enforced through hefty community-issued fines. Then, an unexpected technological wave hit the valleys. To cater to wealthy ecotourists who demanded constant connectivity, telecommunication companies erected mobile towers across previously dead-zone mountain corridors. This sudden digital access transformed the lives of rural women, who had historically been excluded from independent income generation in traditional farming setups. Preparing home-cooked meals for visiting anglers shifted from unpaid domestic labor into lucrative micro-enterprises. Women began taking catering bookings over local messaging apps, serving traditional bush meals straight from their farmhouse kitchens. In one alpine valley, a farmer's wife who began by hosting weekend fishermen expanded her kitchen into a 6-bed bed and breakfast within 2 seasons, eventually hiring 2 neighbors and earning more than her husband's annual cattle return. The economic shift triggered a remarkable environmental recovery in the surrounding forests. For over a century, heavy land clearing and livestock overgrazing had stripped the steep granite hillsides, causing massive topsoil erosion. But muddy runoff ruins trout habitat, and fishing guides gave landholders a blunt ultimatum. If land clearing continues to cloud the rivers, the trout will die, and the tourists will vanish. In response, local timber and grazing trusts took self-directed action, banning all tree clearing and livestock access within 300 meters of any stocked waterway. Though unenforceable by state law, local social pressure carried absolute weight. Thousands of hectares of critical riparian forest regenerated naturally, stabilizing the riverbanks and clearing the water. Soon, wildlife returned. Ornithologists surveying the catchments recorded an unprecedented surge in aquatic bird populations. Azure kingfishers appeared along headwater streams where they had been absent for decades. And the white-bellied sea eagle, a majestic raptor classified as vulnerable across southern Australia, nested in the upper catchment for the first time in 30 years. A completely new demographic of high-spending birdwatching tourists arrived, equipped with high-end camera gear, spending just as much money as the fly fishermen. An artificial stocking project had accidentally birthed an integrated ecotourism ecosystem. Yet, this bioengineering project brought an unforeseen ecological disaster that keeps the narrative strictly honest. Trout are apex predators and aggressive migrators. Over several wet seasons, escapees from the high tarns drifted down into lower river catchments, never intended for stocking. In the mid-altitude river stretches, the introduced trout ran headfirst into vulnerable native populations, particularly the iconic Murray cod and vulnerable native galaxias species. Local fishermen began pulling heavy trout from waters where they had never previously existed, watching native fish stocks plummet wherever trout established breeding territories. For local conservationists and traditional anglers, the introduced trout was no longer an economic savior, but an invasive pest destroying sacred native heritage. Public outrage boiled over, leading to over 300 local landholders, native fish enthusiasts, and environmental scientists signing an urgent petition demanding an immediate halt to all trout stocking. State water authorities responded by testing experimental physical barriers, heavy steel mesh screens installed in key river channels, designed to allow water flow while stopping downstream fish migration. But mountain rivers carry massive debris loads during winter storms. Falling bark, fallen timber, and sediment choke the screens after every heavy downpour, requiring constant maintenance. The threat to native species remains an unresolved biological cost that haunts the project to this day. Then, climate extremes delivered an absolute test. An unseasonal summer deluge hit the ranges, dumping double the monthly rainfall in 48 hours. Main rivers surged 6 meters overnight, tearing away access bridges and isolating high-country communities for over 3 weeks. Field ecologists braced for catastrophic losses, expecting the torrents to flush every fingerling out of the mountain systems. But the biological response stunned the research team. While human infrastructure collapsed, the fish thrived. Trout populations held firm in the deep tarns and actually expanded in several tributaries, feeding heavily on the vast flood of organic nutrients washed off the mountain slopes. In the lower rivers, the extreme flood performed an unscripted evolutionary experiment that no research ethics committee would ever authorize. Over 5 years, isolated fish populations had begun to diverge. Tarn-dwelling trout had adapted to become smaller, ultra-cold hardy survivalists, while fast river strains grew into sleek, aggressive hunters. The floodwaters breached geographic barriers, forcing these distinct genetic strains to interbreed in the wild. Whether this crossbreeding creates an inferior hybrid or an ultra-resilient super trout remains an open scientific question that will take decades to fully evaluate. So, was this $12 million experiment a stroke of regional economic genius or an arrogant ecological error? The reality is a complex mixture of both. The mistakes were undeniably real. Misjudged water bodies, devastating winter losses, and an introduced predator now competing with native aquatic species. Yet, the project achieved what few government initiatives ever manage. It created a self-sustaining ecosystem that thrives without ongoing state intervention. High country communities now actively protect their catchments, native forests are expanding without expensive legislation, and local economic revenue from ecotourism has topped $7 million annually, fully recovering the original state investment. Average household incomes in participating valleys have surged by 62%, reversing decades of youth migration to capital cities. A former stockman who once struggled to make ends meet now earns in a 3-week guiding season what used to take a full year of hard labor. If you want to explore more extraordinary stories where a single human decision fundamentally redefines an entire landscape, make sure to subscribe and follow along as we continue uncovering the world's most fascinating ecological frontiers.